Good evening and welcome to Novara Live. My name is Bastani. We have such a great show for you this evening. I will be joined later by Kieran and Andrieu to discuss all of the things we'll be going over. Stay tuned for that. Coming up tonight, Starbucks in the Middle East have announced some significant impacts of the boycott currently being held against them over the war in Gaza. We'll also be discussing the demise of a certain right-wing TV channel that have had to scale back their operation. And local councils across Britain are on the verge of collapse. Birmingham City Council is today voting on measures that would cut £300 million. Yes, really. Chancellor Jeremy Hunt will announce his spring budget tomorrow, and we already have some idea of what it will include. Government sources have said that Hunt plans to cut national insurance contributions by 2p, saving the average earner £450 a year. That cut comes on top of the 2p cut announced in Hunt's autumn statement last year. But it wasn't Hunt's first choice when it came to cutting taxes. Earlier plans to cut income tax were reportedly shelved after the Office for Budget Responsibility said the country couldn't afford it. And that's after government borrowing costs rose and tax receipts shrank, leaving little to give away, with a national insurance cut being cheaper than an income tax cut because it's only paid by the country's 27 million workers. Even so, the 2p cut will cost the Treasury around £10 billion, and the government is bringing forward legislation that will allow the cuts to come into effect by April. Some might see that as a sweetener for the election due to be held later this year, almost certainly before winter. But given Hunt made a similar move in the autumn and it's not dramatically improved the Tories' position, will it really make an impact? Whatever the political impact, these tax cuts won't come for free. The Times reports this. The Chancellor is considering cutting projected increases for future public spending from 2% to 0.75%, despite warnings that this could lead to significant cuts for unprotected departments. The move would raise £5 billion a year, but leave the Tories open to accusations that it is returning to austerity. Did we ever leave? Hunt will also argue that central government and local authorities need to do more with less, with restricted government spending planned after the election. More with less. Where have we heard that before? Look, you can do more with less for maybe a year, maybe two. You can't do it for 14 consecutive years. UK tax levels are currently the highest they've been in decades, at around 36% of GDP. So presumably a cut to national insurance would bring that down. Think again, because the Institute for Fiscal Studies has also had a look at the figures, and they say they don't add up. The overall tax burden is forecast to hit its highest ever level by 2028. You can see that green line there. But Hunt's cuts will do nothing to slow that, with taxes hitting a record 37% of GDP by 2028. You can see that purple line. And that's equivalent to the tax taken in 1948 during post-war reconstruction. We had things like rations too. Part of the reason for this is that the economy is failing, and after 14 years, the Tories haven't been able to halt that decline. Labour leader Keir Starmer said this: "The Conservatives have failed the economy and failed working people. Families were better off with the last Labour government, and they'll be better off with the next one. Labour is the party of economic security. We'll grow our economy to put more money in your pocket." It would be great to know exactly how Labour plans to grow the economy after canning most of their policy proposals. Other ideas briefed from Hunt's budget show a distinct lack of original thinking, the kind of original thinking that will probably be required to get the economy moving for the first time in 14 years. A fuel duty will be frozen with the promise of bringing it in line with inflation kicked into the next fiscal year. That's a trick the Tories have pulled in every budget since 2011. Meaning the Treasury hasn't increased its cash take from motorists in 13 years. But apparently there's a war on the motorist, remember? Other measures under discussion include increasing taxes on vaping products, holiday lets, and business class flights. Thrilling stuff. There are two better ideas reportedly being considered, both pinched from Labour. First, there's cutting tax breaks to non-DOMs. Secondly, extending the windfall tax on North Sea oil and gas producers. Joining me now is Eleanor Shearer, She's a senior researcher at the think tank Common Wealth. Eleanor, thanks for joining us.
Thanks so much for having me.
What do you make of this national insurance tax cut from Hunt?
Ultimately, it's disappointing. We're at a point in this country where public services are absolutely on their knees after 14 years of huge underinvestment. So for the government to be prioritising giveaways, and giveaways that are regressive, they disproportionately benefit the better off, rather than prioritising public investment, is not the solution to the UK's long-standing low growth and sluggish productivity.
So what would be a better way of using this money then? Because it's about £10 billion. If you had to play with £10 billion to reinvigorate productivity, to get the economy going again, what would you do?
The place I'd start is strategic public investment. And I guess a great place to start in particular is in clean energy. So Commonwealth put out some research in February that was looking at the impact of public investment in the transition to renewable energy. The problem there is that at the moment, the government now and Labour possibly in future are leaning quite heavily on the idea that the private sector will be financing things like offshore wind. But we know that when the private sector has to finance these things, they're more expensive. Ultimately, that translates to higher costs on energy bills. So if I had £10 billion to play with, probably the place I'd start is putting it in some kind of publicly funded energy generator that would direct that public investment to make sure that we get better renewable energy and increase our energy security, so that if there's other energy price shocks in future, like we've just had over the last couple of years, the UK would be in a stronger position.
Well, I hope Rachel Reeves is listening to that. The Tories were saying that they would like to initially have done a cut to income tax. How much more would that have cost? Because, of course, what we're hearing is they were put off from doing that by the OBR, saying it was simply unaffordable. I mean, 10 billion is a lot of money. So how much would we have been looking at if they'd cut income tax?
Well, ultimately, there are a few different considerations with the cut to income tax. I can't give you an exact figure on how much more it would have cost, but I think what's important to recognise here is that all these things about the OBR saying, will this or will this not be affordable for the government? It's important to talk about Hunt's fiscal rules. So we're not dealing here with some kind of naturally preordained limits on what government can and cannot spend. What we're ultimately dealing with is the government saying, we want debts to be falling at the end of this forecast, and that's what's tying our hands. So when they're talking about whether they'll cut this tax or that tax, and whether they have the fiscal headroom to do that, what they're ultimately talking about is this idea that they want debt to be falling in the fifth year of the Parliament. And that's just not ultimately a great way to be making economic policy. Rather than balancing this national insurance cut against this projected cuts to public spending, the projected rises to fuel duty that, as you pointed out, haven't happened since 2011. Rather than basing our economic policy on these fictions, we should be thinking about what is actually going to transform the economic fate of this country. We should be thinking about how we put more money into public services to get better growth.
And the worry with cutting income tax was that it might actually feed into inflation because, of course, there'd be significantly more money in people's pockets. They would spend that. Consumer demand would rise, and therefore we'd see a rise in inflation. Why is this any different? Can you explain this to me? Because obviously, if you're making any kind of fiscal change to give people more money, it would arguably have an inflationary impact of some kind. So either it's a giveaway or it's not a giveaway. If it's a giveaway, there would be some inflation. If it's not a giveaway, then it doesn't make any difference either way.
Well, the discussion about inflationary effects to these sorts of giveaways seems to me slightly beside the point. Commonwealth did some research looking at the impact of inflation, for example, and we're finding that a lot of what's driving it is higher than average profits in particular sectors, particularly sectors that have a kind of concentrated market power. So I would argue that if what the government is concerned about is inflation, that looking at the kind of changes to the edges of our tax system and how much money ordinary people do or do not have to spend, you also see the government talking a lot about the need to be cautious around pay, for example. That's looking in the wrong direction, because that's not where the main inflationary pressures in our economy are coming from.
And finally, I want to ask you if this is really a continuation of austerity, because to go back to some numbers I mentioned a few minutes ago, the Chancellor is looking to cut projected increases for future public spending from 2% to 0.75%. Now, people hear increase. Okay, increase, great. So it's not austerity. Substantially, what does that mean? What does that mean in terms of austerity, in terms of the kinds of public services people can access?
Substantially, it does mean austerity. It means squeezes to budgets that already have been cut to the bone. And in particular, I think it's worth raising the point about the difference between day-to-day spending for departments and capital spending for departments. So as you've had government departments having to do more and more with less, what they're doing is they're taking that money from capital in budgets. They're taking that money from things like building more schools or building new hospitals and having to put it into the kind of day-to-day running costs, like, for example, paying doctors and nurses' salaries or paying teachers' salaries. And what that leads to is a situation where the underlying infrastructure in our public services is crumbling and in dire need of regeneration. But public services just can't afford to put that new money in because their budgets are still under so much pressure. You also mentioned earlier about the effects this is having on local councils, for example, and the number of those going bankrupt as well. I mean, we're just seeing throughout the economy, from the NHS to councils to schools, that we can't afford to keep having these incredibly constrained budgets. We need to have an injection of capital into our public services. And I think there's this sense both on the Tory side and on the Labour side that you can't do public investment until you get growth. I'd argue it's the reverse. You can't get growth until you do more public investment. And so that's where the government's priority should be.
Eleanor Shearer, thanks for joining us here this evening. So informative. Thanks. Really good. Those are great answers. We've been hearing this, by the way, for so long. We need investment to get growth, not the other way around. I mean, we've literally been hearing this for 14 years. Politicians don't seem very interested. You wonder, when is it going to break through? The budget tomorrow will show that the Tories' best economic ideas have been pinched from Labour, whether that's taxing non-doms or energy giants more. But Labour has been helping itself to Tory economic thinking too. This was Shadow Secretary for Work and Pensions, Liz Kendall, speaking earlier this week.
For all the Tory claims about being tough on benefits, over the next 5 years, there will be 600,000 more people on sickness and disability benefits. And these benefits will cost an extra £33 billion. That is more than our current day-to-day expenditure on defence. The Office of Budget Responsibility says the sustained rise in health-related worklessness is holding back growth and living standards while putting ever greater pressure on the public finances. Yet all we get from the Tories is more of the same.
It's not just the Tories offering more of the same, because I've definitely heard those lines before. Grow the economy by punishing a sick and ageing population. And, if in doubt, blame people with disabilities. I'm joined now by Kieran. Kieran, how are you this evening?
I'm very well, Aaron. Glad to be here with you. How are you?
I'm very well. I'm glad to see you are so well lit. We really do pride ourselves on great lighting here at Novara Media. Listen, you just saw that clip with Liz Kendall. Do you think the stuff that she's saying there, is that political triangulation, however distasteful one might find it? Is it just gesturing, symbolism? Or is it something deeper? Do you think Keir Starmer's Labour Party have bought into austerity as a set of policies?
First things first, I think it's absurd. I believe the portion of overall expenditure, government expenditure, that goes towards out of work specifically, which is clearly the target of this kind of rhetoric, out of work benefits, is below 3% of government expenditure. That's the first thing. The second thing to say is, in answer to your question, I think it is political triangulation, but it's political triangulation that masks something much more worrying, much more concerning, and in fact sinister. So when I say it's political triangulation, I don't want to be misunderstood. I'm not saying, yes, it's political triangulation, and when they get into government, they'll govern to the left of their present rhetoric. I think it's clearly trying to appeal, in the way that Starmer has tried to appeal from the start, to a strand of social conservatism that he and his advisors believe exists in critical mass in this country, that will surely win them votes and win them an election, right? And obviously we're talking about the economy, but in some instances, and I think this is one of them, economic conservatism becomes social conservatism. And clearly the culture war that has been with us for well over 20, 30, possibly more years around, lazy, feckless, whatever else it is that the tabloid press and their mouthpieces in Parliament want to call them, people who are out of work, That for a long time has been an example, I believe, of economic conservatism translated very clearly into social conservatism. And if you could appeal, I think he and his advisors feel very strongly to that kind of a gallery, then you're in for a good time at the election. That's clearly in other spheres been part of their strategy to appeal to a kind of social conservatism. I think this is one area where it's crossed over. Now, the reason I think it masks something much more serious and sinister is because I think it masks a complete lack of economic philosophy. And you referred to this earlier, Aaron, and our guest referred to it as well, that without big ideas to meet the big challenges of the 21st century, we're going to perpetuate the trouble that we're currently in as a country that seems to be content with presiding over managed decline. We need big economic ideas. I don't believe that the current leadership of the Labour Party has them. And the second part of your question, is it austerity? Actually, no, it's worse than that. I mean, I'm not saying they will be worse than George Osborne, right? That's not what I'm saying. What I'm saying is George Osborne, for good or for ill, and I believe it's very, very much for the ill, for the bad, had an economic philosophy, and it was brutal, and it was called austerity. I don't believe Keir Starmer has anything so exalted or coherent as that.
I think that's so good. You've really made me think there, Kieran. I think that's spot on. Obviously, what Liz Kendall was saying there was awful, and it's going to have very real political implications, whether or not that's implemented as policy. The rhetoric itself is damaging, just in terms of the wider political culture and conversation in this country. But I think you're right. It's not malicious in an ideological sense. It's really to cover up an absence of thinking. And my biggest worry with the Starmer government, Kieran, is that we have some kind of a crisis, some kind of financial crisis or a war or something like COVID. And they simply don't have the ideological, intellectual tools to actually grasp the situation, and drift becomes the biggest enemy. And in actually that set of circumstances, you can imagine them going in very, very, very weird directions. And I think that's right. Osborne and Cameron, after 2010, very much an ideological project for worse. And I think the absence of ideology is what scares me most with Starmer, even though that's the selling point really to much of the electorate right now. Although I have to say, I really did think it would take a little bit longer for the Labour Party to return to that kind of rhetoric, given Jeremy Corbyn was leader until 2020. More fool me. Local councils across Britain are on the verge of collapse. 8 have already declared themselves effectively bankrupt, with a further 19 approaching the government for exceptional financial assistance. Nearly 1 in 10 council leaders have said they expect to go bust in the coming year, and 2/3 of councils are planning to cut services to plug the holes in their budgets. It's a painful symptom of the economic rot that the Tories have overseen since 2010. But Chancellor Jeremy Hunt has a plan, and he's set to announce it in his budget on Wednesday. He'll tell councils to cut consultants and diversity schemes to save cash. Now, the idea is a joke and an insulting one. Between 2010 and 2015, local authorities saw their budgets repeatedly cut by the austerity economics of the Cameron government. That shortfall has never been made up amidst rising costs. This was the chair of the Local Government Association, Sean Davies, on Radio 4's Today programme.
All councils of all political persuasions, types and sizes and geographies are facing huge pressures right now. We've been encouraged over the last 13 years, to quote a former local government secretary, to act like the private sector, to go out and buy stuff to make a return. And many councils have done that successfully. And of course, there's been examples where that hasn't gone as well as expected. But this goes back to a simple mathematical equation, which is the demand for services is going up a record high. The cost of providing those services is at a record high. The cuts from government are at a record high. And when we increase council tax, it's just simply not enough to cover the difference.
It's in that context that councillors from one of the local authorities hardest hit by austerity have now met to decide how to save it from imminent collapse. The Birmingham City Council has declared itself effectively bankrupt after its budget projections for 2023-24 recorded an £87 million deficit. Wow, £87 million. Now Europe's largest local authority is trying to make cuts in services amounting to £300 million. Leader of the Council, John Cotton, opened the debate.
The budget before Council today is not the budget I entered politics to set. It is not a budget I ever envisaged for our city. Sadly, however, it is a budget that reflects the significant challenges currently facing this council. Because the harsh reality is we must make cuts of over £300 million over the next 2 financial years in order to receive exceptional financial support from government and to meet the challenge set by commissioners. As the report before us states, that is unprecedented in scale. And for that, I unreservedly apologise to the people and communities of our city.
Now, if those cuts go through, up to 600 council jobs could be axed across services like social care, libraries and parks. Other measures include dimming streetlights, reducing bin collections to 1 a fortnight, and raising the cost for burials. Birmingham is also trying to plug the hole in its accounts by raising council tax. Now, usually, councils are restricted to only raising that levy by 5% each year. But Levelling Up Secretary Michael Gove has given Birmingham special permission to make much bigger increases. This year, council tax in Birmingham will rise by 10%. Next year, it'll go up by a further 10%, meaning that Birmingham residents will see their council tax bills increase by 21% by next spring. And that amounts to an additional £280 of council tax on a property in Band A and £840 for one on Band H. Usually an increase of that much would require a referendum. So how did Birmingham get here? Partly it's due to a projected £1 billion compensation bill for gendered pay discrimination. That bill is on top of £1 billion already paid out to settle discrimination claims following a Supreme Court ruling in 2012. The court found that 174 council workers, mostly women, had been discriminated against for years when they were denied bonuses and overtime paid to men doing work of equal value. There are currently at least 3,000 council workers seeking compensation from the council as a result. But Birmingham Council leader John Cotton also laid the blame squarely at the feet of the Tories.
There is a raging crisis running right across local governments. And that crisis, I have to say, is on the Conservative Party. A party that was the cheerleaders for austerity, the apologists for a 40% reduction in real terms central government funding for councils between 2010 and 2020. And year after year, in this chamber, we have heard members dismiss concerns, ignoring that growing clamour for an end to the Conservative Party's neglect of public services. And I have to ask, how did we think that was going to end? Austerity always was a false economy, but it was also a slow burn. And the tragic consequences of the decisions that have been made since that coalition of chaos was formed back in 2010 are now there for all to see.
Birmingham isn't alone. Last week, Nottingham City Council axed hundreds of jobs and cut social and youth services to try to balance its books. And across the country, councils are expecting to face collective deficits of more than £5 billion by 2026. Kieran, these are extraordinary numbers, aren't they? Are people in various councils going to blame local or national government? Because, of course, actually local government is responsible for a bunch of things like adult social care that people generally associate with national government. So who's going to be punished here? Westminster or local government?
I mean, first of all, I'll say this. I actually work at a local authority, so I have to be fairly high level and abstract in what I say. I can't be too particular or specific. But I think generally speaking, it will be local authorities who are punished, and it will be the administrations of local authorities that are primarily blamed. I think the Tories are deeply unpopular. It's not clear to me that the periods in which they were popular and unpopular, according to polling data, correspond with austerity and cuts to local authorities and services. And actually, I do think that there was a calculated decision made by returning to that period between 2010 and 2015 by the Cameron-Osborne regime that if it did cut funding in Labour-led local authorities, they were essentially insulated from consequence because it would have a double benefit. One, it would shrink the state for them and comply with their austerity program and save money for the Treasury, and at the same time, it would rebound negatively in electoral terms on local Labour Party administrations. That makes me think of another point I want to stress, which is it's a bit more of a philosophical point, but government of this kind, or the kind that we've had over the past 14 years, or the kind that we had between 1979 and 1990 when Margaret Thatcher was in power, they always stress that they believe in small government, that they want to shrink the state, that, to quote Reagan, government is the problem, not the solution. It never, ever happens. That's the rhetoric, but the state always swells. It always becomes bloated. Areas are sold off to private firms and so on of the economy. So yes, in that sense, the state shrinks. But that's usually offset by the building up of the apparatus in the security state, or the apparatus prerequisite to steal civil liberties, which is something we're seeing happening at the moment. The only state that the state seems pretty blithe to shrink and cut is the small state. In other words, local government. And local authorities going bankrupt, local authorities investing huge amounts of money in private firms and the private sector, local authorities having to inflict very swingeing and severe cuts to extremely critical frontline services. This is not normal in the sixth largest economy in the world. It's really not. And in the end, of course, it's ordinary people who suffer. There are, just very briefly, I'll just say this, there are three ways outside of direct government funding that local authorities can raise revenue. One of them is council tax. Another is through right to buy receipts. And finally, through business rates, raising of revenue through business rates. Council tax is highly regressive as it is because the differentials between rich and poor generally are very, very small. But also it means that, it means that, government cuts they tend to be passed on to residents in the form of raised council tax. And at a time when services are being cut back. So they get worse service, they pay more for it. Business rates, the more commerce you have in your borough, the more revenue you can raise. But the more revenue you raise, the better you can provide services, the more investment you attract. So we see a kind of dynamic of regional imbalance playing out, where in one borough something is a virtuous cycle, in another it is a vicious cycle. I agree with the chap from Nottingham Council. It's a false economy. It's a myopic strategy. And I think it will have very serious consequences for our society and its institutions if it isn't rectified or addressed soon.
I think Birmingham, as we've mentioned on the show a few times now, is really the front line of all of this. Just to go over again what's happening there, 600 people are going to be laid off. They're going to have to sell. I didn't mention this on today's show. I mentioned it, I think, a week or two ago. They're going to have to sell off £1.2 billion worth of assets. They're going to have to increase council tax, as we've said, by 21%. By the way, the average council tax bill is already very high in this country. Council tax has gone up significantly since 2010 because of the things Kieran was just talking about. So 600 laid off, selling 1.2 billion worth of assets, increasing council tax, and then making cuts to things like child and adult social care services, which are important, right? When people think about cutting local services, they think, oh, well, libraries are going to shut. Oh, well, I don't use it. I'd like it if it was there, but whatever. That's not what local government does. It's not just libraries. I like libraries, by the way. I'm not dismissing or diminishing that. But there are things like adult social care, which are really, really core competencies of the state, which are being cut. And by the way, it's an aging society we're living in, so those costs are going up. So at the moment, the costs are going up, the income's going down. It's a major, major problem. I want to hear from you guys as well. Where you are, how big a deal are cuts to local services? I really think that the Tories, in a way, don't care about this stuff because it's one of the many crises they can lumber Labour with after the next general election. We're seeing it in universities, we're seeing it in local government. We are looking at massive financial crises in massive areas of our society, and that's not the deficit with regards to national expenditure by central government. We're talking about other state competencies which actually are administered elsewhere, like I say, higher education, local government. We're talking, I think, hundreds of billions of pounds are going to have to be generated from somewhere. And of course, if Labour try and do that after the next general election, the Tories will say, look, typical Labour, high tax. And it's been a false economy the last 14 years because they've screwed all this up and we've had zero growth, zero productivity growth, very low wage growth, real living standards have fallen. Nobody's happy. That's what happens when you get Osborne and Cameron in charge, and the media don't just not criticise them, they endorse them. They fanned the flames after 2010. And if you went against them, like students did 14 years ago, they were so stupid, they didn't know what they were doing. Only idiots protest. Well, who are the idiots now? Rupert Murdoch's TalkTV launched as a linear TV channel in April 2022. The idea was to shake up British broadcasting and replicate the success of Fox News across the Atlantic. Murdoch launched that in the mid-1990s, and it subsequently transformed US news media in the almost 3 decades since. But less than 2 years after the launch of TalkTV, it's all over. That's right, TalkTV will no longer be on TV. And the station will be shifting exclusively online by the summer. A website Guido Fawkes obtained an email sent by Scott Taunton, President of Broadcasting at Murdoch's News UK, to all TalkTV staff. It says this: it is obvious to all of us that for the majority of people, news consumption is shifting online. People are checking the news via their smartphones, and the highest consumption of Talk's content is already online and growing. 2 years ago, we would not have been brave enough to launch a channel without a linear presence. But audiences of all ages have moved fast, and smartphones are now the primary device where news is consumed. We need to adapt to this as a priority. We are therefore intending that Talk comes off linear television from early summer, and our focus will be on streaming. Now, it's true that viewers are increasingly shifting to online platforms, but that's been the case for 20 years. Facebook has been around since 2004, not 2024. We didn't all start using smartphones last Christmas. It's also true, however, the channel has been dying from day one. Indeed, the Now Acts Politics show, The News Desk, hosted by Tom Newton-Dunn, did not register a single viewer over several broadcasts in 2022. It's true. And that was according to the official TV rating agency Barb. Even Piers Morgan himself appeared to admit that linear TV was a bad idea pretty much as soon as TalkTV started. He tweeted this in 2022. Insane numbers just shows that content really is king and can be consumed in so many different ways. Linear TV increasingly irrelevant to total eyeball potential for a global show like this, especially with younger viewers who don't really watch TV anymore. Younger viewers don't watch TV anymore, so let's set up a linear TV channel. Sounds really smart. Kieran, make sense of the TalkTV fiasco to me.
I mean, I'm not sure I can. I do think that TalkTV came along at an inopportune time. It came along at the same time as GB News. And GB News, I think, has cornered that part of the market. I mean, that's the way I read it anyway. I don't have a particularly intimate relationship with TalkTV. I've very rarely watched it, even in the form of clips online. So perhaps I'm well placed to answer this. I think it struggled to carve out a niche for itself. It struggled to carve out an identity for itself in a way that GB News was very effective at doing. I'm comparing them because I think that they are broadly analogous. In the time that they came along, their model and the kinds of audiences they appealed to. TalkTV, respect to it in a sense for having genuinely left voices, those that were willing to go on it. But its strategy has always been quite mystifying to me. Again, I don't think it has a particularly distinct identity in the way that GB News clearly has managed to establish. And I think it's probably suffering or has suffered largely as a consequence of that. whether you could deconstruct that and say it's bad comms, it's bad branding, it's a lack of imagination on X, Y, and Z, I couldn't say.
I mean, I would just say it was bad TV. We were talking a few weeks ago about the appearance of a trade unionist on a show with not Mike Graham, who's the other one? James Whale. And I said, what the hell is going on here? Zero professionalism, not very interesting. Car Crash TV, I would be embarrassed to broadcast that. They made it as a clip and put it on social media. So I'm not really that surprised, although the data around certain shows getting 0 views, statistically 0. So maybe like 5 people watch, but in terms of Barb ratings, 0 views is utterly extraordinary. And remember, this is something which was started by Rupert Murdoch, right? The man behind Fox News rather. The most influential news network of the 21st century, without a doubt. And yet he's also behind TalkTV. So either he's lost the Midas touch, or maybe he's not as smart as we all think, and actually some other people were involved in Fox, probably a bit of both. Just before TalkTV launched, there was also the arrival of GB News. You remember their launch was plagued with technical difficulties and political differences that ultimately saw the departure of flagship presenter Andrew Neil. And more recently, Ofcom have found the channel to be in breach of their code multiple times, including this weekend when they weighed in on the saga of Lawrence Fox's misogynistic rant about journalist Ava Evans. That controversy saw Fox and the presenter who indulged him, Dan Wootton, dismissed. Despite these issues, GB News has enjoyed significantly more viewers than the likes of TalkTV over the last 2 years. But while they've done so, they've also made huge losses. Last year, the channel ran a deficit of over £30 million. And today, GB News announced that figure had risen by 38% to £42.4 million. That's just in the last 12 months. Meaning since its launch in 2021, the channel has lost £76 million. Imagine what we could do with that here at Novara Media. 76 million. That's not their spend, that's what they've lost. Now, the owner of GB News is a company called All Perspectives, over a third of which is owned by this guy, Paul Marshall, a hedge fund tycoon who's also presently trying to buy The Telegraph. It's reported that Marshall's All Perspectives has injected GB News with a further £41 million of funding. In other words, it looks like Marshall is funding GB News at a major personal loss. Now, he might think those losses will fall, and they probably will. After all, the channel is growing. Its revenues increased by 80% to over £6 million last year. But it's hard to believe he thinks he'll get his money back. Kieran, do you think Paul Marshall will be concerned at these kinds of losses? £76 million in 2.5 years is really something.
Well, I don't know how rich Paul Marshall is, but I do have a theory about some elements of the ultra or super rich, one that I can't prove at all, which is that they enjoy plunging their money into ventures like this. Some of them enjoy the losses, I suspect, that they can be so profligate and insulated from the consequences of their profligacy, I think gives them a thrill. It reminds me of, there's a largely forgotten economics tract from the late 19th century by a chap called Torsten Veblen, I've probably pronounced that wrong, called The Theory of the Leisure Class. And he talks about this very specific thing, very rich people engaging in what he called conspicuous consumption, and part of that being losing lots and lots of money on ventures. So I suppose some of that is maybe going on. I don't know how rich Paul Marshall is, and I don't know what type of personality he has, but it's possible. Another thing I would say is, on a more serious note, I would assume that at a certain point he thought that he would get a return on investment, either financially or ideologically. And I think it's arguable, given GB News survived its initial major teething problems and will probably be with us for some while longer, it's arguable that in ideological terms, he's achieved that return on investment in that he's managed to get all of the strangest barnyard ideas housed under one roof and have it all aired there.
Yes, I've got some thoughts on this. You know, I don't doubt for 1 second. This is something that GB News people would say. They would say that, look, yes, the press in this country is quite right wing, but the broadcast media is to the left of the press. You know, it's got quite a liberal bias. I agree with that. I've seen the BBC, Sky, Channel 4. I've seen them up close and personal, kind of like New Labour vibes. That's generally the default politics of people in broadcast. And they would say, look, we're trying to correct that a little bit. And we want to represent people who are otherwise unrepresented in broadcast media. Forget the fact that Nigel Farage has been on BBC Question Time more than anybody else. Okay, well, that's a coherent argument. I don't entirely dismiss it. But again, imagine if you had a left-wing news channel which could lose, in 2.5 years, £76 million. You could effectively burn money. Do you know how popular you could make left-wing ideas? I mean, I actually think with a budget of a fraction of that, you could be more influential than the BBC. And I'm not joking, you know. And I say that as somebody who's part of an organization which has 700,000 subscribers on YouTube. Okay, we're not the BBC, but I have some idea of how the media works. To spend that much money, you can get a hell of a lot of influence. One to think about. While investors are more than happy to pour millions into newspapers and TV channels that advance a certain agenda, one that favours the elite, us here at Novara Media don't have massive investors that bankroll our whole operation, and we never received a giant sum of seed capital to get started. In fact, we started with precisely £0. Instead, we rely on donations from our audience, and our supporters are the reason this organisation has grown. As I said, we now have over 700,000 subscribers here on YouTube, and the average monthly donation we received last year was just £6. So when we say we're people-powered, we mean it. We're working hard to provide coverage that centres the majority of society who are regularly ignored by legacy media. So if you're in a position to support our work, then head over to novaramedia.com/support and become a supporter today. A big thank you to all of you who already support us each and every month. Our work would be impossible without you. That link again, if you need it, is in the description box below. Breaking news. Boycotts work. At least that appears to be the case with Starbucks in the Middle East. The company's Middle Eastern franchisee is the Al Shire Group. They're headquartered in Kuwait, and they've just announced 2,000 members of staff will be laid off, which is around 4% of their workforce of around 50,000 people across North Africa and West Asia. Explaining that decision, a spokesperson for the group said this. As a result of the continually challenging trading conditions over the last 6 months, we have taken the sad and very difficult decision to reduce the number of colleagues in our Starbucks, MENA, Middle East and North Africa stores. We will ensure that we give our colleagues leaving the business and their families the support they need, and we would like to express our deepest thanks for their hard work and dedication to Al Shire Group and the Starbucks brand. The Starbucks responded to that news saying this. Our thoughts are with the Green Apron partners who will be leaving, and we want to thank them for their contributions. Starbucks remains committed to working closely with Al Shire to drive long-term growth in this important region. Emphasis there on long-term, because short-term, they ain't growing. In December, Starbucks Chief Executive Laxman Nareshman wrote a letter to company staff which highlighted escalating protests against the company as a major problem. And in January, Starbucks told investors that it was seeing a, quote, significant impact on the traffic and sales in the Middle East amid calls to boycott the company for its alleged support of Israel. Shares in Starbucks have dropped by almost 12% over the past year. That's pretty extraordinary. It's important to note that Starbucks is just one brand of many facing these kinds of issues, particularly in West Asia and North Africa, as a result of protests. In January, McDonald's chief executive Chris Kempczinski said misinformation about alleged support for Israel was having a, quote, meaningful impact on sales by its franchisees in the region. Kieran, we always hear, don't we, from the clever clogs in the media, well, people can't do anything, people power doesn't work. This is a pretty clear example of boycotts and protests having a massive impact on one of the world's most iconic brands.
Yeah, it's a wonderful thing. And that I know that in saying that, I'm partly describing people losing their jobs, but it is nonetheless absolutely necessary to arrive at a place of greater justice. And if Starbucks or if any of these companies cared so much about their green apron partners, or whatever ridiculous corporate term they conjure up to name their workers, who they otherwise no doubt mistreat, then I think they should stop funding genocide. They should stop supporting a genocide. It's as simple as that. So yeah, it's a wonderful, very wonderful thing. By virtue of my familial background, I've been somewhat involved in this struggle, albeit from England since the late 1990s. And back then, the idea that Starbucks, which we always, well, in the 2000s, because Starbucks wasn't here yet in the late 1990s, but by the time it was here, many, 20 years ago, we used to always congregate outside Starbucks and stop outside those businesses that were continuing to do business with an apartheid regime. Very few people acknowledged it was an apartheid regime back then. Very few people felt compelled to stop drinking their favorite drinks or getting their favorite snacks from Starbucks and shops like it. Now, 20 years later, we're in a position where there are measurable material losses to Starbucks and other large corporations because they are complicit in their own economic way with the process of genocide. And really, it vindicates, Aaron, the entire strategy, which is, okay, we move away from violence, right? Let's move away from violence. In the 1990s, there was a not everybody adhered to it, but there was a definite acceptance in Palestinian civil society and among the leaders of Palestinian resistance that non-violent means were to be embraced and pursued. So where do you go after you've rejected violence? You go to a place where the consequences are still harsh and hard. You go to the economy, you go to economics, you go to BDS. And initially it was a small acorn, but it's clearly starting to flourish now, with companies like Starbucks and McDonald's having to admit such things. We're clearly raising the costs. And I would say to everybody who cares about this, listening or watching, that continuing to raise the costs is the only way we're going to achieve Palestinian statehood and Palestinian justice.
These boycotts are really having a big material impact. You know, we've seen it with McDonald's, like I say, with Starbucks, particularly in MENA, Middle East, North Africa, which is a growth market. You know, you've got saturated markets for these kinds of products in Europe, in North America. And all of a sudden, you've got a big growth market saying, actually, we're not interested in what you're offering anymore, which is a big deal. The bottom line really matters. And I have to say, again, I don't know how people watching this or listening later on feel about this. You know, I was in the co-op the other day. I went to buy some avocados, being a millennial socialist, and it said product of Israel. And I instinctively was repulsed. And, you know, you want to talk to these people and say, why the hell are you selling these products? I've got a certain position in regards to sanctions. I don't agree with sanctions. Now, I know with Israel, people might disagree, or they might say with South Africa, they worked, which is true. But they also killed maybe hundreds of thousands of people in Iraq during the 1990s. They are leading to many avoidable deaths in places like Iran, Cuba, and they're generally a tool for powerful states against poor states. But boycotts by civil society are a very different creature. And realistically, you know, boycotts across MENA, you're looking at a market of hundreds of millions of people. That's a serious proposition for any business. And wow, is it working? Kieran, thanks for joining us here this evening.
Thanks for having me, Aaron. It's been a pleasure.
It has been a pleasure. And thanks to all of you for tuning in. Come back tomorrow for another stream. You've been watching Novara Media. Good night.